The prairie lay scorched yellow under the late summer sun, stretching endlessly in all directions, like a vast ocean of dying grass. Cold Creek, once a silver ribbon that had given life to the valley, had shrunk to a thin brown scar, threading weakly between cracked banks that showed white mineral deposits like old bones. Heat shimmered over the far hills in waves that bent the light, making the distant mountains dance and waver. The air tasted of ash and desperation, thick enough to choke on. Martha Holst staggered through the brittle grass, each blade crackling beneath her feet like breaking glass. Her dress, once a respectable calico pattern of blue flowers on cream, was torn at the shoulder, where a nail had caught it during her desperate flight from the burning cabin. The fabric was stained black with soot, and the hem dragged heavy with dust. Her lungs burned with each breath, and her legs trembled under the weight of exhaustion that had long since passed from physical into something spiritual, a weariness that lived in the marrow of her bones. Behind her, perhaps 3 miles distant now, a thin column of smoke rose into the cloudless sky, marking the spot where her cabin had stood that morning. The home Gideon had built with his own hands 10 years ago, each log cut and notched and fitted with the patient skill of a man who believed he was building something permanent. Now it was nothing but embers and ash, another grave on this pitiless frontier that swallowed dreams and spit out bones. Her 2 sons clung to her skirts, their small hands white-knuckled, and desperate fingers twisted into the fabric as if letting go meant falling into an abyss. Tom, the older boy, at 8 years, dragged his feet through the grass with a shuffle that spoke of complete exhaustion. His eyes, once bright with the curiosity of childhood, had gone dull with hunger and shock. The boy had not spoken since they fled the cabin, his voice stolen by the sight of flames eating the only home he had ever known. Jamie, barely 6 years old, whimpered with each step, a constant low sound, like a wounded animal. His cracked lips moved silently, forming words that would not come. Both boys were thin as saplings' ribs, pressing against their shirts in hard ridges, skin burned dark by the relentless sun. They had not eaten a proper meal in 3 weeks, subsisting on thin bean broth and hope, and now even the hope was gone. Martha's own vision blurred dark spots dancing at the edges as her body began the process of shutting down. But she forced herself forward, 1 foot, then another. The town was miles away, across the baking plains, a distance that might as well have been to the moon. The riders who had burned her home were somewhere behind her, their laughter still ringing in her ears like a death knell of the sound of men who killed for wages and slept soundly afterward. A sound broke through the haze of heat and exhaustion. Hoofbeats steady and closed the rhythm, speaking of a strong horse and a rider who knew how to conserve its strength. She stopped swaying like a wheat stalk in wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. Another rider, another threat. She had nothing left to give, no money, no jewelry, nothing except the folded papers pressed against her ribs inside her dress, and the 2 boys clinging to her skirts. She pulled them closer, their small bodies pressing against her legs, and turned to face whatever came next. The horse that appeared over the rise was a bay gelding 16 hands high, its coat dark with sweat that had turned the dust on its flanks to mud. The animal was well-muscled, well-fed, moving with the ground-eating stride of a horse bred for endurance rather than speed. The rider sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders broad, his posture speaking of a man comfortable with long hours in the saddle. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a wide hat, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, the hawkish nose, the watchful set of his eyes. Feathers hung from his hair, bright against the dying light, eagle feathers. She realized with a jolt of fear that went through her like electricity. A war bonnet. Lakota, her breath caught. In the town, in the settlement houses, in the churches on Sunday, she had heard the stories. Savage, heathen, scalper, child stealer. The words had been repeated so often, they had become truth, a litany of fear that needed no proof. but now facing this man on his horse, while her sons clung to her and the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. Those words seemed hollow, the echoes of other people's prejudices, rather than anything real. The warrior reined in beside them, his horse snorting and tossing its head, foam flying from the bit. The animal's ears flicked toward the horizon, where distant dust rose in thin trails like smoke signals. More riders, coming this way. Martha's knees buckled, but she forced herself upright through sheer will. The warrior's gaze swept over her with the practiced assessment of a scout, taking in the torn dress, the soot stains, the desperate grip of the boys, the column of smoke still rising behind them. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the copper skin. His hand rested on the rifle slung across his saddle, a Winchester repeater she noted distantly, the kind that cost a month's wages, but he made no move to draw it. The horse stood between them, a living barrier of muscle and heat and the smell of sweat and leather. On one side, the warrior, his face unreadable, his body tense as a drawn bowstring, every line speaking of controlled power and hard-won survival skills. On the other, Martha and her sons, filthy, starving, and alone. The empty prairie stretched away in all directions, offering no shelter, no help, no hope under the pitiless sky. Martha opened her mouth. Her tongue was swollen, her throat raw from smoke and thirst. Her voice came out as a ragged whisper, barely more than a breath, carried on the hot wind that smelled of dust and dying things. "Take me home." The words surprised her, even as she spoke them. Not help us, not please, but take me home. As if such a place still existed, as if home was more than ashes and memories. The warrior's eyes met hers. They were dark and steady, carrying a weight she recognized, lost grief, the kind of weariness that came from burying people you loved, and knowing there would be more graves before the end. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The prairie wind whistled through the grass, and somewhere a hawk cried out its voice, sharp and lonely. Then he shifted in the saddle leather, creaking, glancing again at the smoke, at the dust rising in the distance, at the sun dropping fast toward the hills. The light was going golden now, the shadows stretching long. In another hour it would be dark, and the prairie at night was no place for a woman and two small boys on foot. "I'll take you," he said, his voice low and steady, accented but clear. The words were English, but shaped by a mouth more accustomed to Lakota, the consonants slightly harder, the vowels more open. His gaze flicked to the boys, and his expression softened just slightly. Something almost like gentleness moving across his face. "And I'll take you too." He extended his hand. Martha stared at it. The hand was large, rough-skinned, with calluses across the palm from reins and rifle stock. The knuckles were scarred from old fights, the nails clean, but worn short. A stranger's hand. A Lakota hand. A hand that belonged to a man her people had taught her to fear. In another time, another place with different choices available, she might have pulled her boys away, turned her back, chosen the dust and the heat, and even death over the risk of trusting someone the newspapers called savage. But the coyotes were already yipping in the hills, their voices rising in chorus as the light began to fail. The armed men were somewhere behind them on the trail, men who had laughed while they burned her home and would laugh again while they finished the job. The sun was dropping fast, painting the western sky in shades of blood and fire, and her sons were dying by inches. She took his hand. His grip was strong, pulling her up behind the saddle in one smooth motion, born of long practice. Her chest pressed against his back, her arms wrapping around his waist, because there was no other way to stay mounted. He smelled of leather and sweat and sage smoke, a scent that was utterly foreign, and somehow reassuring in its strangeness, proof that other ways of living existed beyond the narrow confines of her own experience. He reached down and hauled Tom up to sit in front of him, settling the boy against his chest. Then he looked down at Jamie, who stood trembling in the dust, too exhausted even to cry. "Hold the stirrup leather," Whoppy said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Hold tight. Run when I run. Don't let go no matter what." Jamie's small hand clenched the leather strap, his knuckles bone white. The boy's face was pale beneath the dirt, his eyes huge and glassy with shock. Then Whoppy spurred his horse, and they were moving not at a gallop yet, but at a steady trot that ate up the ground while conserving the horse's strength. The animal responded to the slightest pressure of knee and heel, moving as if rider and mount were a single creature. Martha felt the shift and surge of muscle beneath her, the rhythmic pounding that matched the beat of her own heart. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the thud of hooves on packed earth, and Jamie's ragged breathing as he ran alongside, his legs pumping in desperate rhythm. Martha looked back once and saw the dust cloud behind them, closer now, resolving into individual riders. 5 of them, maybe 6, coming fast. Whoppy saw it too. His spine stiffened, and without a word, he urged the horse into a canter, then a full gallop. Jamie cried out, his legs a blur, but somehow he kept his grip on the stirrup leather, his small body stretched out, almost horizontal, as the horse accelerated. The prairie flew past in a blur of yellow grass and red earth. The wind tore at Martha's hair, pulling it free from the pins until it streamed behind her like a dark banner. Tom made a small sound, frightened but not panicking, and Whoppy's arm tightened around the boy, holding him secure. The first rifle shot cracked across the prairie, the sound sharp and unmistakable. The bullet kicked up a plume of dust 3 feet to the left, close enough that Martha felt the wind of its passing, close enough to kill. Her breath stopped in her throat. The riders were in range now, and they were shooting to kill. Whoppy wrenched the horse to the right, angling toward a shallow wash cut into the prairie by centuries of runoff. The horse stumbled, its hoof catching in a prairie dog hole, and for a terrible moment, Martha thought they would go down, thought she would feel the impact of hard earth and then the thunder of pursuing hooves. But the gelding recovered, lurching sideways, and plunged down the bank into the wash. The gully was perhaps 6 feet deep, its walls crumbling sandstone and hard-packed clay. A trickle of muddy water ran along the bottom, barely enough to wet the stones. Whoppy guided the horse along the twisting channel, using the walls for cover, moving with the sure instinct of a man who had spent his life reading terrain and using it to survive. More shots came, but they were firing blind now, the shooters unable to see their targets below the rim of the wash. Bullets whined overhead, chipping rock, but none came close. Whoppy kept moving, following the bends and curves, always staying low, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Jamie was sobbing now, his legs giving out, unable to keep pace. Without breaking stride, Whoppy reached down and hauled the boy up by the back of his shirt, swinging him across the saddle in front of Tom. Now both boys were mounted, pressed together against Whoppy's chest, and the horse was carrying 4 people. The animal was tiring, its breathing labored foam flying from its mouth. Whoppy knew they could not keep this pace much longer. He needed to lose the pursuers, and he needed to do it soon. Ahead, the wash branched. To the left, it continued straight toward the setting sun. To the right, it curved north toward a cluster of red rocks that rose from the prairie like broken teeth. Whoppy took the right fork, then immediately dismounted, pulling Martha and the boys down with him. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." He slapped the horse's rump, sending it galloping up the left fork at full speed, its hoofbeats echoing off the walls. Then he grabbed Martha's hand and pulled her into a narrow crack in the wall, a fissure barely wide enough for her shoulders. The boys squeezed in after her, and Whoppy pressed in last, his body shielding them, his hand covering Jamie's mouth to muffle the child's panicked breathing. They heard the riders come, the thunder of hooves growing louder. Voices shouted harsh and triumphant. The sounds passed by their hiding place, following the riderless horse up the left fork, chasing the easier trail. Whoppy waited, counting his heartbeats. 100, 200. The sounds faded into the distance. Still he waited, knowing that impatient men made fatal mistakes. Finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to convince him the riders were truly gone, he eased out of the crack and looked both ways along the wash. Empty. The light was failing fast now, the sun a red coal balanced on the western horizon. "We walk from here," he said quietly. "North, through the rocks. They'll search all night, but they'll search the wrong places." Martha nodded, too exhausted for words. She took Jamie's hand, and Tom took her other hand, and together they followed the Lakota warrior north into the gathering darkness. They walked through the night, a slow and painful journey over broken ground. Whoppy led them through terrain that seemed impassable, narrow defiles between towering rocks, steep slopes of loose shale that slid underfoot, dry creek beds choked with thorny scrub. But he moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, following paths invisible to Martha's eyes. Twice they heard riders in the distance, and each time Whoppy froze his hand, raised in warning, until the sounds faded. Once a coyote trotted across their path so close, Martha could see its eyes reflect the starlight. It paused, watching them with alert curiosity, then melted into the shadows without a sound. The boys stumbled along in a daze beyond exhaustion, moving only because their mother's hand pulled them forward. Martha herself existed in a strange state between waking and sleeping, her mind drifting through memories and hallucinations. She saw Gideon standing in the doorway of their cabin, his broad shoulders blocking the light. She saw the flames again, eating the roof, the terrible beauty of fire consuming everything she owned. She saw the man who had lit the match, Scarface. Sam, they called him, a lean wolf of a man, with a scar cutting his face from eyebrow to jaw, and the cold amusement in his eyes. Sometime after midnight, Whoppy called a halt in a sheltered hollow between three large boulders. He helped Martha arrange the boys so they could lean against her, and then opened his canteen and gave them each a small sip of water. Not enough to satisfy, but enough to keep them alive. "Rest," he said. 2 hours, then we move again." "How far?" Martha's voice was a croak. "Silver Spur, 10 miles. He paused, studying her face in the starlight. "You can make it. Your boys can make it. I've seen people walk farther on less." "Why are you helping us?" The question hung in the air between them. Whoppy was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Your husband, Gideon Holst. I found him yesterday, on the trail by Cold Creek." Martha's breath caught. She had known somewhere in the core of her being that Gideon was dead. Crowley's words that morning, "Your husband's dead, ma'am." Tragic accident had carried the weight of truth. But hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud by this stranger, made it real in a way it had not been before. "How?" she whispered. "Shot. Twice. Close range." Whoppy's voice was matter-of-fact but not unkind. His shirt was torn open, papers scattered. Someone was looking for something. Martha's hand went instinctively to her own dress, feeling the crackle of folded papers pressed against her ribs. The copies Gideon had made of Crowley's ledgers, the evidence that could hang Crowley and every man who rode for him. "I found one page." Whoppy continued. He pulled the mud-stained paper from inside his shirt and unfolded it carefully. Even in the starlight, Martha could see Gideon's handwriting, the careful notation of dates and dollar amounts and names. It talks about dynamite, about a washout, about a Lakota camp. Martha closed her eyes. He was trying to stop it. Crowley's planning to blow the dam on Cold Creek. He'll wash out the farms, the camp, everyone downstream. Call it an accident of nature and claim the land. How many? Wappy's voice had gone very quiet. 20 cases of dynamite, Gideon said. Maybe more, when the first big rain comes. Martha opened her eyes and met his gaze. There are children in that camp, he told me. Children and old people and families just trying to survive, same as us. Wappy's jaw tightened. For a moment his face was utterly still, a mask carved from stone. Then he folded the paper carefully and tucked it away. Then we finish what your husband started, he said. We get you to town. We get these papers to someone who can stop Crowley. Why do you care? Martha asked. We're strangers. White strangers. Your people have no reason to help us. Wappy looked away, his gaze distant, fixed on something Martha could not see. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old grief. 2 years ago, soldiers came onto Lakota land. They said they were chasing cattle thieves. They found my brother instead, Maddo. He was 16 years old. He loved horses. He could track a deer through solid rock. Wappy paused, and Martha heard him swallow hard. They shot him. Said he was armed. He wasn't. He was carrying firewood. But they shot him anyway, and they rode away, and no one was ever punished. No one even asked questions. Martha felt tears sting her eyes. I'm sorry. So am I. Wappy looked back at her, and in the starlight, his eyes were dark and fathomless. I buried him in the hills. I carved his name into a stone. And I swore that if I ever had the chance to stop men like that, men who kill because they can, because they have power and others don't, I would take it, no matter what it cost me. He stood checking the position of the stars, orienting himself. Your husband tried to stop them. He paid with his life. You're still fighting. Your boys are still alive. That's worth something. That's worth everything. He offered his hand again. Martha took it, letting him pull her to her feet. 2 hours are up, he said. Time to move. They reached Silver Spur just before dawn, entering through the back of the livery stable as Wappy had planned. The town was small, barely more than a single dusty street, lined with false front buildings that leaned drunkenly in the morning breeze. A saloon, its painted sign faded and peeling. A general store with barrels of flour and sugar stacked on the porch. A land office, its windows dark and forbidding. A blacksmith shop, the forge cold at this hour. And at the far end, squeezed between the general store and the blacksmith, like an afterthought, a small building with a hand-painted sign that read AEF, Ames MD. Wappy approached the back door of the clinic and knocked twice softly. A pause. Then twice more, a signal. Martha heard movement inside, the shuffle of feet, and then the door opened a crack. A weary face peered out, eyes magnified behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Wappy, the man said, his voice cautious. He was perhaps 55, with thinning gray hair and a face lined by years of hard work and harder choices. What's this? Widow and 2 boys, Wappy said quietly. Burned out by Crowley. Need help. Dr. Frederick Ames opened the door wider, taking in the sight of Martha and the boys. His expression shifted from caution to concern to something like anger. Come in, he said. Quickly. The clinic was small, cramped, smelling of carbolic and old blood, and something else Martha could not quite name: despair, perhaps the accumulated weight of suffering these walls had witnessed. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with bottles and jars, filled with mysterious liquids, their labels written in Latin script. A narrow examination table stood in the center of the room, its surface scrubbed but permanently stained. A desk in the corner was piled high with ledgers and medical texts, and a single oil lamp cast long shadows across the floor. Dr. Ames guided Martha to a chair and knelt in front of the boys, his hands gentle as he examined them. He checked their feet, red and blistered from walking. He peeled back their lips to look at their gums pale from malnutrition. He lifted their shirts to count ribs, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. "When did they last eat?" he asked. 3 days ago. Martha said, her voice hollow. "Thin broth. Before that, maybe a week. We've been starving slowly since Crowley dammed the creek." Ames's hands clenched into fists, then relaxed with visible effort. "Another week," he said quietly, half to himself. "And I'd be burying the small one. Maybe both." He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a brown bottle and pouring a measure of dark liquid into a tin cup. "Beef broth," he said, adding hot water from a kettle on the small stove in the corner. "Sip it slowly. Your stomachs need time to remember how to work." He gave the cup to Martha, who held it to Jamie's lips. The boy drank in desperate gulps, his eyes closing in something like rapture. Tom waited his turn with the patience of a child who had learned that food was scarce and precious, while the boys drank Whoppy and Dr. Ames moved to the desk. Martha heard their voices low and urgent, and saw Ames's face grow pale as Whoppy explained what had happened. She pulled the papers from inside her dress and handed them to the doctor. Dr. Ames unfolded them with shaking hands and began to read. His lips moved silently, forming words of disbelief and rage. The pages were covered with Gideon's careful handwriting copies he had made in secret while working in Crowley's office. Dates, amounts, names. Payments to Sheriff Claude Hensley marked as consulting fees, but clearly bribes. Orders for dynamite from a supplier in Denver, 20 cases of it, enough to blow a hole in the earth the size of a barn. Notes about final washout and clearing obstructions and clean title. And a map, crude but detailed, showing the course of Cold Creek, the location of the dam, and the Lakota camp downstream that would be obliterated when Crowley blew the charges. "Goodness," Ames whispered. He looked up at Martha, his face stricken. "Your husband copied all of this. He worked for Crowley for 2 years. Martha said, her voice breaking. "He helped build that dam. He moved the boundary stakes when Crowley told him to. He signed the papers that stole land from farmers and from your people." She looked at Whoppy. "But then he couldn't do it anymore. He saw what Crowley was planning and he tried to stop it. And they killed him for it." Dr. Ames set the papers down carefully as if they might explode. "I sent a telegram 3 days ago to the territorial marshal. I told him there was corruption in Silver Spur water theft, possibly worse. He replied that he was dealing with a stagecoach robbery near Iron Mountain, but would investigate when time permitted." "When?" Whoppy asked, his voice sharp. 6 days, maybe 7. He's riding circuit covering a lot of territory." Ames rubbed his face, suddenly looking much older. "If I send another telegram with this evidence, he might come faster. But Crowley has eyes everywhere. The telegrapher is on Crowley's payroll." Whoppy finished. "We know. Within an hour of you sending that wire, Crowley will know what it says." "Then what do we do?" Martha spoke up, her voice stronger now, fueled by the same rage that had sustained her through the long night's walk. "We fight. We take these papers to the marshal ourselves. We ride out to meet him on the trail. We don't wait for Crowley to finish what he started." Both men looked at her, startled. Dr. Ames shook his head. "Mrs. Holst, you can barely stand. The boys will be stronger after they eat and rest. So will I." Martha stood swaying slightly, but refusing to sit back down. "My husband died trying to stop this. I won't let his death mean nothing. I won't let Crowley win." Whoppy studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing. Then he nodded slowly, something like respect showing in his face. "There's more," he said quietly. He pulled out another sheet of paper, this one with different handwriting, hasty, almost frantic. I found this yesterday tucked in the back of Crowley's ledger when I was scouting his ranch. Dr. Ames took it and read aloud, his voice shaking. BC, I can't do this anymore. Enough people have died. If you blow that dam, I'm done. I won't be part of mass murder. It's signed C.H. Claude Hensley. The sheriff, Martha breathed. And here's Crowley's reply. Whoppy said, pointing to the bottom of the page. Then you're done now. But you'll keep your mouth shut, or your daughter in Denver learns what kind of man her father really is. I have letters. I have proof. One word from you, and she'll know everything. Dr. Ames set the paper down, his hand trembling. Hensley's trapped. He's not just bought, he's blackmailed. Which means he might turn. Whoppy said. If we can offer him a way out, if we can protect his daughter. That's a big if, Ames replied. It's the only if we have. A sound outside made all of them freeze, the jingle of spurs, the heavy tread of boots on the wooden boardwalk. Whoppy moved instantly, positioning himself between the door and Martha, his hand dropping to his knife. Dr. Ames grabbed a scalpel from his instrument tray, holding it like a weapon. The footsteps passed by without stopping, fading into the distance. They all exhaled slowly. You can't stay here, Ames said. Crowley will search every building in town once he knows you're here. And he will know. Someone always talks. I know a place, Whoppy said. An old line shack 2 miles north of town. Used to belong to a trapper named Dutch Henry. He's dead now and no one uses it. We can hide there while we plan. Martha looked at her boys, who had fallen asleep sitting up exhausted beyond measure. How long do we have before Crowley comes? Hours, Whoppy said. Maybe less. Then we move now. They spent the next 3 days at the line shack, a ramshackle structure of weathered logs and patched canvas that leaned heavily to one side as if the wind had been trying for years to push it over, and had nearly succeeded. The single room smelled of old smoke and mouse droppings and dry rot. But it had a roof that kept out the rain and walls that blocked the wind, and that was more than many had. Dr. Ames brought food and medicine after dark each night, slipping out of town by back trails, always watching for followers. He brought salt pork and cornmeal, dried beans, and molasses, and most precious of all, fresh water in earthenware jugs. He brought news too, none of it good. Crowley had indeed learned that the widow had made it to town. He had ridden in at noon the day after they arrived with a dozen armed men and Sheriff Hensley in tow. They had searched the clinic from top to bottom, tearing through Dr. Ames's supplies and scattering his medicines. Finding nothing, Crowley had threatened to burn the building down. Only the intervention of Esther Burnside, the schoolteacher, had stopped him. She stood right up to him. Ames told them, his voice filled with admiration. All 5 feet and 90 pounds of her, telling Crowley that if he burned down the only medical facility within 50 miles, the territorial governor would hear about it, and she would personally make sure he hanged for it. The woman has a spine of steel. But Crowley had not given up. He had posted men at every road out of town, watching for Martha and the boys. He had offered a reward, $50 for information leading to their capture. And he had sent riders out to Pierre Dubois' farm and the French settler, who had also been cheated by Crowley's water schemes. They burned him out. Ames said, his voice heavy. 3 nights ago. Drove off his cattle, smashed his plow, shot his dog. Pierre barely got his wife and children out alive. They're staying at the church now, sleeping on the pews. The man's lost everything. Martha felt sick. Another family destroyed because of Crowley's greed. Another home turned to ashes. But there was good news, too. Esther Burnside had organized a secret meeting of the farmers and small landholders who had been hurt by Crowley's schemes. More than 20 people had come risking Crowley's wrath to hear what Dr. Ames had to say. When he showed them the copied ledger pages, when he explained what Crowley was planning, the anger in that room had been palpable. "They want to fight," Ames said. "But they need a plan. They need leadership. And they need proof that will hold up in a court of law." "We have proof," Martha said, touching the papers hidden in her dress. "We have copies. Crowley will claim their forgeries. We need the original ledger, or we need Crowley himself caught in the act." Whoppy had been silent through all of this, sitting by the small fire they kept burning in the shack's stone fireplace, carving a piece of willow wood with his knife. Now he looked up. "There's another way," he said quietly. "We don't wait for Crowley to blow the dam. We make him come to us. We choose the ground. We set the trap." Dr. Ames frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Whoppy unfolded a paper Gideon's hand-drawn map of the area, showing Cold Creek and its tributaries. He pointed to a spot marked in pencil. "Boxwood Canyon, a side channel that feeds into Cold Creek. Narrow walls, high rocks, one way in and one way out." Gideon marked it as good deadfall ground. He was planning something before he died. Martha leaned forward, studying the map. "What kind of something?" Whoppy's finger traced the canyon's outline. "A trap. The rocks here are unstable sandstone, badly weathered, sitting on shale layers that crumble when wet. You could lever a big slab, loose balance it on a prop, and bring it down with a single shot. Bury anyone underneath." "That's murder," Ames said flatly. "That's survival," Whoppy replied. "Crowley's already killed Gideon. He burned out the Holst farm and the Dubois farm. He's planning to drown a whole Lakota camp and call it an accident. He won't stop until everyone who threatens him is dead." Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. The old Martha, the woman who had cooked and cleaned and raised her boys in the shadow of her husband's decisions, would have recoiled from this talk of traps and killing. But the old Martha had burned with the cabin. The woman who sat here now had watched her home destroyed, had fled through the night with her children, had held her dying husband's blood-stained papers against her heart. "How would it work?" she asked. Whoppy looked at her with surprise and then respect. He turned back to the map. "We send word that we're riding to meet the marshal. We make sure Crowley hears it, let it slip to someone we know will talk. He'll follow us. He has to. We're the only witnesses who can put a noose around his neck. He'll bring his men, try to finish us before we reach federal law. And we lead him into Boxwood Canyon." Dr. Ames said, slowly beginning to understand. "Exactly. We set up the deadfall ahead of time. We lure him into the bottleneck, and we drop several 100 pounds of rock on his head. What about his men? There's a dozen of them, maybe more. We don't have to kill them all. We just have to kill Crowley and break their will to fight. Without Crowley, without his money, they're just hired guns. They'll scatter." Dr. Ames was quiet for a long moment, his face troubled. Finally, he sighed. "I'm a doctor. I took an oath to preserve life, not end it. But I've also buried too many people who died because good men did nothing." He looked at Martha. "It's your choice, Mrs. Holst. Your husband died for this. What do you want to do?" Martha looked down at her hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work. She thought of Gideon lying dead on the trail, his shirt torn open, his life spilled out in the dust. She thought of Pierre's children homeless and frightened. She thought of the Lakota families camped downstream, the children Whoppy had told her about, who would drown when Crowley blew the dam. "We do it," she said. "We set the trap. We end this." Whoppy nodded. "I'll need a day to prepare the canyon. Move the rocks, set the charges." "I'll send word through Esther," Ames said. Make sure it reaches Crowley's ears that you're leaving town, heading east to meet the marshal. And I'll make sure we're seen, Martha added. Me and the boys in a wagon. Make it look real. It is real, Whoppy said quietly. After this is over, you'll need to meet the marshal anyway, show him the evidence. We're just choosing the route. Over the next day, Whoppy rode to Boxwood Canyon and studied the terrain with the practiced eye of a hunter. The canyon was perhaps 200 yards long, with walls that rose 30 feet on either side. The floor was choked with sagebrush and loose rock barely wide enough for a wagon. Near the far end, where the canyon made a slight bend, a large slab of sandstone jutted out from the western wall, hanging suspended like a shelf. Whoppy climbed up to examine it. The rock was huge, easily 1,000 pounds, held in place by centuries of friction and luck. But underneath the supporting shale was crumbling, shot through with cracks. With the right leverage, the right pressure, it would fall. He worked through the heat of the afternoon, using deadfall branches as levers, wedging them under the slab, prying it loose inch by inch, until it balanced precariously on a single cottonwood peg he had shaped and hardened in fire. The peg was thick as a man's wrist, angled just so. A bullet strike in the right place would shatter it, and the slab would drop. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was simple physics, the same principles that made a deadfall trap for catching deer scaled up to catch men. As he worked, Whoppy thought about his brother Maddo. He remembered teaching the boy to track, to read sign in dust and grass, to move silently through the forest. He remembered Maddo's laugh, bright and infectious, the way he could mimic bird calls so perfectly that flocks would land nearby calling back. He remembered holding his brother while he died, blood bubbling from the wounds in his chest, his eyes wide and confused, asking why. This was why. Because men like Crowley existed, men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who stood in their way. Men who faced no consequences because they had money and power and the law in their pocket. But not this time. This time justice would be served, even if Whoppy had to carve it out with his own hands. They left the line shack before dawn on the 4th day, traveling in a borrowed wagon driven by Esther Burnside, with Martha and the boys sitting in back under a canvas cover. Dr. Ames rode alongside on a borrowed mule, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. Pierre Dubois, his arm in a sling from the burns he had suffered when Crowley's men torched his farm, insisted on coming too. "I have nothing left to lose," the Frenchman said in his heavy accent. "My farm, she is gone. My animals gone. If I can help stop this man, then my suffering means something, yes." They made no attempt at stealth. They wanted to be seen. They rolled down Silver Spur's main street in broad daylight, and within minutes, word had spread. By the time they reached the edge of town, Crowley knew. Whoppy rode ahead on his bay gelding, scouting the trail while the wagon followed at a slower pace. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, all red rock and yellow grass under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. They reached Boxwood Canyon by mid-morning. Whoppy had chosen the timing carefully, late enough that the sun would be in the pursuers' eyes as they entered from the west, early enough that they would have daylight for what came next. The wagon entered the canyon wheels, creaking over loose stone. The walls rose on either side, sheer faces of pale sandstone striped with rust and black. The air was still here, trapped between the cliffs, baking hot. Tom and Jamie huddled close to their mother, their eyes wide, sensing danger, even though they did not understand it. Whoppy positioned the wagon near the center of the canyon, under a slight overhang that would provide cover. He helped Martha and the boys down, guiding them to a sheltered ledge above the canyon floor where they could watch without being exposed. "When it starts," he told Martha, pressing his spare revolver into her hands, "you keep the boys behind you. You stay low. If I fall, if something goes wrong, you run. You follow that narrow cut at the back of the canyon. It leads up to the rim. You run, and you don't look back. Understand? Martha took the revolver, feeling the weight of it, the cold steel against her palm. I understand. Their eyes met and something passed between them, unspoken but profound. In another life, another world, there might have been time for more. But not here, not now. There was only survival and the hope that they might both live to see tomorrow. Whoppy climbed down and checked his rifle, a Winchester 73 lever-action 15 rounds in the magazine. He had used this rifle to hunt deer and elk, to defend his family's camp from raiders, to put down injured horses with mercy. Now he would use it to kill men, and he felt no hesitation. Some things needed killing. Dr. Ames and Pierre took positions among the rocks, each armed with rifles borrowed from Esther's deceased husband's collection. Neither man was a gunfighter, but both had hunted game, and at close range that would have to be enough. They waited. The sun climbed higher. Sweat ran down Whoppy's back, soaking his shirt. A lizard scuttled across the rock near his hand, paused to study him with one bright eye, then disappeared into a crack. Then they heard it, the sound that sent ice through Whoppy's veins. Not gunfire, not horses. Thunder. From the head of the canyon came a growing rumble, low and ominous, building like a storm. Dust rose in a thick, choking cloud, and through it came cattle. Longhorns, their wide-swept horns catching the light, their eyes rolling white with panic. 50 head, maybe more, driven hard by riders at the rear, men who fired pistols into the air and screamed like demons. Crowley had not come with just his men. He had brought his herd. He was going to stampede the cattle through the canyon, crushing anyone in their path under 1,000 hooves. "Up!" Whoppy shouted. "Everyone up! Get on the ledges!" There was no time for plans, no time for anything except raw survival. Martha grabbed her boys and scrambled higher, climbing one-handed while clutching Jamie's shirt, her feet slipping on loose rock. Dr. Ames hauled himself up beside her, panting. Pierre tried to follow, but his burned arm gave out and he fell crying out in pain. Whoppy ran, not away from the stampede, but toward it, angling across the canyon floor, rifle in one hand. He grabbed the wagon's horse by its bridle, turning the animal, using it as a living shield to split the herd. The terrified horse reared, screaming, its hooves flailing. Whoppy held on his arms, burning every muscle, straining. The lead steers hit the wagon. Wood splintered with sounds like gunshots. A wheel flew off, spinning crazily. The horse broke free, bolting sideways, and the herd split around it, flowing like water around an obstacle. Whoppy dove for cover as a horn grazed his shoulder, tearing through his shirt and opening a line of fire across his skin. He rolled, came up running, and threw himself into a narrow crevice in the wall as cattle pounded past on both sides. The sound was overwhelming, hooves like drums, the clash of horns, the bellowing of terrified animals, the shouts of the riders at the rear. The smell of cattle, thick and rank, mixed with dust that choked and blinded. The ground shook, rocks falling from the canyon walls. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The main herd had passed through, leaving wreckage in its wake. The wagon was matchwood. Several cattle had gone down, trampled by those behind, and now lay dead or dying in the dust. But Martha and the boys were alive, clinging to their ledge. Dr. Ames was alive, his face white with shock. Even Pierre had survived, dragging himself into a crack just before the hooves arrived. And now, riding through the dust and carnage, came Bartholomew Crowley with a dozen armed men. Crowley sat tall in his saddle, his face red with rage and triumph. He wore a black coat despite the heat, and his vest strained across his belly. His pistol was drawn, and his eyes swept the canyon, searching. Behind him rode Scarface Sam, his scar livid in the harsh light. The rest were hired guns, hard men with empty eyes, men who killed for wages. Sheriff Hensley was there too, Whoppy noted with cold satisfaction. But the man sat his horse apart from the others, his face gray, his hands shaking. When their eyes met, Hensley gave the slightest shake of his head, a warning or perhaps an apology. "Mrs. Holst," Crowley's voice boomed off the canyon walls. "I know you're here. Come out and we can settle this like civilized people. No one else needs to die." Martha stood on her ledge shaking with fury. "You burned my home. You killed my husband. There's nothing civilized about you." Crowley's smile was like a knife. "Your husband was a thief and a traitor. He stole my property, those papers he copied. Property I want back. Give them to me and I'll let you and your boys walk away. You have my word." "Your word is worthless. Then I'll make it simple." Crowley raised his pistol, aiming at the ledge where Tom and Jamie huddled against their mother. "Give me those papers, or I start shooting children." Time seemed to slow. Whoppy pressed into the shadows of the crevice, calculated angles and distances. The cottonwood peg was 30 yards away and up, barely visible against the pale rock. The slab it held hung directly above Crowley and his men. One shot. That was all he would get. But Crowley's pistol was already aimed at Martha's boys. Martha saw it too. She stood frozen, trapped between impossible choices. Surrender the papers and die anyway, or refuse and watch her sons die first. Then Scarface Sam spoke up, his voice lazy and amused. "Boss, something ain't right. Why'd they come here? This canyon's a dead end. They had to know we'd follow." Crowley frowned, his pistol lowering slightly as he looked around, really seeing the terrain for the first time. His eyes traveled up the walls, taking in the narrow confines, the lack of escape routes. "It's a trap," Sam said flatly. He pointed at the rock shelf above them. "And I'd bet my best horse that's part of it." He raised his rifle, aiming at the cottonwood peg. No time to think, no time to plan. Whoppy surged out of the crevice, his rifle already rising. His shoulder blazed with pain where the steer's horn had grazed it. His hands were slick with sweat. The peg was small, 30 yards away, barely bigger than a silver dollar, and Sam's rifle was already tracking toward it. Whoppy fired. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet flew true, crossing the distance in the space between heartbeats. It hit the peg dead center with a crack like lightning. For one eternal moment, nothing happened. The peg held. Whoppy's heart sank. Then the peg exploded into splinters. The slab groaned a deep sound, like the earth itself was shifting. It tilted forward, balanced for one impossible second on nothing but momentum and prayer. And then it fell. 1,000 pounds of sandstone, dropping from 30 feet up, hit with the force of divine judgment. It struck the canyon floor directly in the center of Crowley's men, and the world erupted into chaos. 2 men went down, immediately crushed beneath the main slab, their screams cut off in an instant. The horses panicked, rearing and bucking, throwing their riders. Smaller rocks, dislodged by the impact, rained down in a lethal cascade. A horse's leg snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the animal went down screaming. Dust boiled up thick as fog, blinding everyone. And then the shooting started. Whoppy levered another round into his Winchester and fired into the dust, aiming for shapes and shadows. He could not see clearly, but neither could they. He kept moving, changing positions, firing twice, and then rolling to a new location, making them think there were more defenders than there actually were. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. Another chipped rock inches from his hand, spraying him with stone fragments. He fired back, saw a shadow go down, could not tell if he had hit anything vital. Through the dust, he heard Crowley shouting orders, his voice high and panicked. "Get behind the rocks. Find cover. Kill them all." Martha, on her ledge, pressed her boys flat, and raised the revolver Whoppy had given her. She had never fired a gun at a person before, had never imagined she would need to. But now, seeing shapes moving in the dust below, men with rifles searching for her children, she found that her hand was steady. A figure emerged from the dust, looking up, rifle rising. Scarface Sam. Martha fired. The revolver kicked hard, nearly breaking her wrist. The bullet went wide, striking Rock. Sam's head whipped around his scarred face, twisting with rage as he spotted her. He brought his rifle up, aiming directly at her face. Tom screamed. "Mama!" Sam's finger tightened on the trigger. And then Whoppy was there, charging out of the dust like a ghost, slamming into Sam from the side. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. They rolled in the dust, trading blows that had nothing civilized about them. Sam was bigger, heavier, his body thick with muscle. But Whoppy was faster, fueled by rage and desperation, and the memory of his brother bleeding out in his arms. Sam's fist caught Whoppy in the jaw, snapping his head back, filling his mouth with blood. Whoppy spat and drove his elbow into Sam's throat. Sam gagged, eyes bulging, and clawed for the knife at his belt. Steel flashed in the dim light. Sam's knife came up slashing. Whoppy jerked back, but not fast enough. The blade opened a deep gash along his forearm, cutting through muscle, blood spraying hot and red. Pain exploded up Whoppy's arm, but he could not stop, could not slow down. He grabbed Sam's wrist with both hands, his own blood making everything slippery. They struggled, the knife between them, each trying to turn the blade toward the other. Sam was stronger. Inch by inch, the knife turned toward Whoppy's throat. He could feel his strength fading, blood loss making him dizzy. The knife point touched his skin, and he knew he was about to die. Then Martha was there. She had climbed down from the ledge, moving while both men were focused on each other. In her hands was a rock, the size of a loaf of bread, rough and heavy. She brought it down on the back of Scarface Sam's head with all the strength born of terror and rage, and a mother's desperate need to protect her children. The impact made a sickening sound, wet and final. Sam's grip on the knife went slack. His eyes rolled back, showing white, and he collapsed forward, his full weight pinning Whoppy to the ground. Whoppy shoved the body off, gasping his arms, screaming with pain. He looked up at Martha, who stood trembling, the rock still clutched in her hands, her face white with shock at what she had just done. "Thank you," Whoppy managed. Martha dropped the rock and reached down, helping him to his feet. Blood ran down his arm in rivulets, dripping from his fingers. She tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped it around the wound, pulling it tight. The pressure was agonizing, but it slowed the bleeding. Around them, the battle was winding down. Dr. Ames had managed to shoot one of Crowley's men in the leg, sending the man screaming from his horse. Pierre, despite his injured arm, had held his position and fired steadily until his rifle clicked empty. The remaining hired guns, seeing their leader's right-hand man dead and half their number down, were already fleeing, spurring their horses back toward the canyon entrance. Only Crowley remained. He had dismounted during the chaos, taking cover behind a large boulder. Now he crouched there, his fine coat covered in dust, his face twisted with rage and fear. He still held his pistol, and his eyes swept the canyon, searching. "Hensley," he shouted. "Get over here. We can still salvage this. Help me and I'll double your pay." Sheriff Claude Hensley sat on his horse at the canyon entrance, watching the carnage with an expression of profound sorrow. Slowly, deliberately, he dismounted. He walked toward Crowley, but not to help him. "It's over, Bartholomew." Hensley said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore. I won't." Crowley's face purpled with fury. "You coward, you pathetic weak. I'll ruin you. I'll tell your daughter everything. She'll know what kind of man her father really is." "Then she'll know," Hensley said quietly. and maybe that's what I deserve." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "But first, she'll know what kind of man you are. This is my full confession. Everything I did for you, every bribe, every lie, every crime. I wrote it out last night, and I sent a copy to the territorial marshal this morning." Crowley stared at him, his mouth working soundlessly. Then understanding dawned, and his face went from red to white to red again. You. He raised his pistol, aiming at Hensley's chest. Dr. Ames, still holding the pistol he had taken from a fallen gunman, shouted, "Don't!" But Crowley was beyond reason now, beyond anything except rage. His finger tightened on the trigger. And then the cattle came back, the remnants of the stampeded herd, scattered and panicked by the rockfall. And the gunfire had milled about at the far end of the canyon, confused and frightened. Now driven by some instinct to return to familiar ground, they turned as a group and came thundering back through the canyon, a wall of horns and muscle and blind animal panic. Crowley heard them too late. He spun, his eyes going wide with terror, and tried to run. But his fine boots slipped on loose rock, and he went down, his ankle twisting with a crack. He screamed, trying to crawl, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls hemmed him in. The boulder that had been his shelter now blocked his escape. Hensley tried to reach him, tried to pull him clear, but the herd was too close, too fast. "No!" Hensley shouted, his hand outstretched. The cattle hit Crowley like a wave. A massive longhorn with scarred horns, the lead bull slammed into him first, tossing him like a rag doll. He landed hard, something breaking with an audible snap. Then more cattle trampling over him, hooves coming down again and again. It was over in seconds, but those seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. When the herd finally passed, when the dust settled, Bartholomew Crowley lay broken in the dust, his body trampled beyond recognition. The man who had acted like judge and hangman with other people's lives had been killed by the very animals he had used as a weapon. Hensley stood at the edge of the carnage, his face gray, his whole body shaking. He looked at the body and then at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one in particular. "I was wrong, and I am so sorry." They buried the dead in a shallow grave at the mouth of Boxwood Canyon, marking it with a simple cairn of stones. No words were spoken over them. What could you say about men who had chosen money over mercy, who had died trying to commit murder? The survivors, Whoppy Martha, her boys, Dr. Ames, Pierre Esther, and Sheriff Hensley, made camp that night on the prairie, nursing their wounds and trying to process what had happened. Dr. Ames cleaned and stitched the gash on Whoppy's arm by firelight, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Whoppy bore it in silence, his jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. "You'll have a scar," Ames said quietly. "I have many scars," Whoppy replied. "One more doesn't matter." Martha sat with her boys, holding them close. Tom was crying, finally releasing the terror he had held inside for days. Jamie had not spoken since the battle, his eyes distant, lost in a place Martha could not reach. She rocked him gently, singing the German lullabies Gideon had taught her, hoping the familiar melody might bring him back. Pierre sat with his wife and children, who had been brought from town by Esther that afternoon. They spoke in rapid French, holding each other, tears running down their faces. They had lost everything, but they were alive and together, and that was something. Sheriff Hensley sat apart from the others, his back against a wagon wheel, staring into the fire. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a single day. Whoppy walked over and sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I could have stopped him," Hensley said finally. "Years ago, when he first started, I could have said no. I could have done my job." "Why didn't you?" Hensley's laugh was bitter. "Money at first. He paid well. And then he had leverage. My daughter. My secrets. He owned me piece by piece until there was nothing left. You broke free at the end, Whoppy said. That counts for something. Does it? Hensley looked at him, his eyes haunted. I helped him steal land. I looked the other way, while good people were ruined. I let your people be pushed off their hunting grounds because it was easier than standing up to him. Can that be forgiven? Whoppy thought about his brother Matto lying in his grave in the hills. He thought about all the injustices he had seen, the casual cruelties, the laws that protected the powerful and punished the weak. I don't know, he said honestly. But you can try to make it right. You can testify. You can help undo the damage. Hensley nodded slowly. I will. Whatever time I have left, however many years or days, I'll spend trying to fix what I broke. They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn low. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, riding hard with 4 deputies. William Cord was a lean man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the scene at Boxwood Canyon, walked through the blood and the broken rocks, and listened to each witness in turn. The story came out in pieces: Crowley's scheme to dam Cold Creek and drown out the farms and the Lakota camp. Gideon Holst's desperate attempt to expose him. The burning of the Holst and Dubois farms, the stampede and the battle. Martha showed him the copied ledger pages, now stained with sweat and blood, but still legible. Hensley gave him the signed confession, along with additional information about Crowley's network of corruption. Marshal Cord sent deputies to Crowley's ranch, where they seized the original ledgers and account books. The evidence was overwhelming: years of fraud, bribery, theft, and conspiracy. There'll be arrests, Cord told them. Everyone who worked for Crowley, everyone who took his money to look the other way. This valley's going to see a house cleaning like never before. What about Crowley's land? Pierre asked. His water rights. Seized by the territorial government. It'll take time to sort out, but the courts will restore what was stolen. Farms will be returned to their rightful owners. Water rights will be allocated fairly. Cord looked at Whoppy. That includes your people's access to Cold Creek. I'll see to it personally. Whoppy nodded, something tight in his chest, loosening slightly. It was not everything. It would not bring Matto back. But it was justice of a kind. The dismantling of Crowley's dam began a week later. A crew of miners from Iron Mountain Lakota men, including Whoppy's uncle and cousins and farmers who had lost nearly everything, worked side by side, swinging hammers and prying loose timbers. It took 3 days of hard labor, but finally the last support gave way. With a roar like thunder, the dam broke and Cold Creek roared back down its natural channel, reclaiming the course it had followed for 10,000 years. Water rushed past the place where the Lakota camp sat, past the burned-out foundations of the Holst and Dubois farms, spreading life across the valley like a benediction. Martha stood on the bank with her boys, watching the water flow. Tom was smiling, the first real smile she had seen in weeks. Jamie still had not spoken, but he had stopped crying, and that was progress. Whoppy stood beside her, his arm in a sling, the wound healing slowly. They did not touch, did not speak, just stood together in comfortable silence, watching the water flow. What will you do now? Whoppy asked finally. Martha had been thinking about that. The homestead was gone, burned to ashes. But the land remained, and the water was flowing again. Rebuild, she said. Not there. Somewhere new. Gideon left some notes, maps, and papers. Dr. Ames found them yesterday, hidden in the wagon we brought to town. Legal documents giving me a share of water rights upstream. And something else. She pulled out a folded map, weathered and stained. He marked a spot here 2 miles north of the old cabin. A sheltered hollow where a spring feeds into the creek. He wrote, "Good soil, good water, hidden from the wind." I think he was planning to move us there before before everything happened. Whoppy studied the map. He knew that place, a sheltered bend in the creek surrounded by cottonwoods with dark, rich soil along the bank. Good land, safe land. "I know it," he said. "There's an old trapper's shack there. Roof's still good. Walls are solid. You could make it work. Will you help me?" The question hung in the air between them. Whoppy knew what she was really asking, not just for help building a cabin, but for something more. Partnership, trust, maybe eventually more than that. He thought about the empty years ahead, years of riding alone, scouting for wages, walking the line between two worlds and belonging to neither. He thought about Maddo and what his brother would have said. Maddo, who had believed in second chances, in the possibility that people could change, could be better than their worst moments. "Yes," Whoppy said, "I'll help you." Over the following weeks, a new community began to take shape along the restored Cold Creek. Pierre and his family rebuilt their farm with help from neighbors raising a small cabin and barn. Dr. Ames expanded his clinic, hiring an assistant to help with the increased patient load. Esther Burnside reopened her school, and this time no one dared threaten to burn it down. Martha's new home rose slowly, built with peeled logs that Whoppy and his Lakota relatives cut from the hills. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a good roof and a stone fireplace. The boys had their own corner with real beds instead of a single shared cot. Martha planted a garden in the rich soil by the creek potatoes and carrots beans, and squashed the seeds donated by neighbors who had little to spare but gave anyway. Whoppy taught Tom how to track, how to read the signs of animals and weather. He taught Jamie how to whistle, how to call birds from the trees, how to laugh again. Slowly, painfully, the boy came back from wherever he had gone, speaking first in whispers, and then in full sentences, and finally laughing the sound bright and clear as bells. Martha learned too. She learned how to shoot straight, how to skin a rabbit, how to set snares and read weather in the clouds. She learned Lakota words and phrases, practicing them with Whoppy's cousins when they visited. She learned that survival on the frontier required more than hope and hard work. It required community cooperation, the willingness to see people as people, rather than as types or stereotypes. And she learned slowly how to trust again. How to let someone stand beside her rather than behind or ahead. How to share burdens and laughter in the quiet moments when words were not needed. Romance grew in small, practical gestures. Whoppy always handed Martha the better tool, the sharper knife, the sturdier shovel. Martha always saved him the best portions of meat, the first bread from the oven, the warmest place by the fire. When riders appeared on the horizon, fewer now, but old habits died hard, and they moved without speaking. Martha drawing the boys close, while Whoppy stepped forward, rifle ready, forming a wordless line of defense. They did not speak of love. The word was too large, too uncertain for people who had lost so much and learned to be wary of promises. But they spoke of tomorrow and next week and next year's planting. They spoke of whether to add a second room to the cabin, whether Whoppy's family might camp nearby for the winter, whether Tom might benefit from learning to read Lakota as well as English. One evening, as autumn painted the hills in gold and rust, Whoppy presented Martha with a carved willow stake, its surface smoothed and polished. "For measuring the water," he said, "you set it here at the high water mark. Each year you'll see if the season is kind or hard. Know when to plant, when to prepare for drought." They knelt together by the creek's edge, pushing the stake into the wet earth. Their hands overlapped on the smooth wood fingers, intertwining briefly, knuckles muddy. The touch lingered longer than necessary, and when Martha looked up, she found Whoppy watching her with an expression she could not quite name, tenderness, perhaps mixed with hope and uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for saving us, for staying." "Thank you," Whoppy replied, for letting me stay, for seeing me as a man, not as a label, for giving me a reason to build instead of just survive. Upstream, Tom and Jamie played in the shallows, their laughter carrying on the wind. The prairie stretched away in all directions, vast and pitiless as ever, but no longer quite so lonely. The starving widow, who had once begged a stranger, "Take me home," now stood on land secured by evidence and sacrifice and hard-won justice. Beside her was a Lakota warrior who had answered, "I'll take you too," and who kept answering every day, not as a savior, but as a partner in the difficult, honest work of building a life on the frontier. They did not speak of love, but perhaps they did not need to. Love was in the stake they planted together in the garden they tended in the cabin they built with their own hands. Love was in the simple fact of showing up day after day, choosing each other in the small and large decisions that made up a life. It was not perfect. Nothing about frontier life was perfect. There would be hard winters and failed crops, sickness and sorrow, the constant struggle against a land that gave nothing without a fight. But they would face it together, this unlikely family forged in fire and blood and desperation. And that was more than enough. It was home.